My brother told me about a night that changed everything for him. He was watching a live stream of Bella Reacts, that popular late-night show where the host breaks down real-life mysteries, when a woman walked into the studio as a special guest. He said he knew the moment he saw her that she hadn't slept in days. Her name was Hannah, a 34-year-old financial crimes investigator for the police department. But it wasn't her profession that caught his eye. It was her gaze. Her eyes didn't just reflect the raw grief of someone who had recently lost a loved one. Instead, they held the haunted, piercing look of a woman trapped between agonizing heartbreak and a massive, unresolved suspicion. Sitting across from the host, Hannah took a deep breath, looked straight into the microphone, and began her monologue. To be honest, I haven't slept a wink these past few days. Sometimes I try to convince myself that I'm just overthinking, but the more I try to push the thoughts away, the more tangled my mind becomes. 7 days ago, my husband passed away. The police and the company called it a routine workplace accident. But deep down in my gut, I just can't bring myself to believe it. I know people might think I'm just a grieving widow making things up, but I believe in a woman's intuition, especially when you've shared a decade of your life with someone. Sometimes, a single glance is all it takes to know when something is terribly wrong. And what breaks my heart the most isn't just his sudden passing. It's the agonizing, sickening feeling that in his final moments, he was absolutely terrified. His name was Owen. He was a senior electrical engineer. If I had to describe Owen in one word, it would be meticulous. He was incredibly cautious, especially when it came to electrical safety. Even at home, if he was just changing a simple light bulb, he would shut off the main breaker and test the socket multiple times before touching it. I remember one time I went to plug something in with completely dry hands and he genuinely lost his temper. He looked at me and said, "The longer you work with electricity, the more you have to fear it. All it takes is 1 second of carelessness and you don't get a second chance. So tell me, how does a man like that die from accidental electrocution? It makes no sense." We met back in college. Owen came from nothing. He used to ride this beat-up motorcycle that would break down every couple of miles. Yet every single night, he would drive across the city just to grab late-night bites with me after my classes. He wasn't the type to buy flowers or fancy gifts, but he loved me fiercely. There were nights when my shift ended near dawn, and I'd walk through the door to find him fast asleep at the dining table waiting for me. He had covered the food tightly so it wouldn't get cold. He was a man of action, not words. That's why when I got that phone call, my entire world shattered. I was in the middle of a high-stakes briefing when an unknown number called my phone. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just telemarketing. But the phone rang repeatedly, demanding my attention. When I finally answered, a breathless voice asked if I was Owen's wife. In that exact fraction of a second, my heart pounded violently against my chest. My instincts screamed. Then came the words, "Your husband was electrocuted on site. He's being rushed to the ER." My mind went completely blank. The phone slipped from my hand and crashed onto the floor. My colleagues had to literally carry me to the car and drive me to the hospital. The entire way there, I called Owen's phone over and over again, dialing until the screen grew burning hot in my hands, praying to God it was all just a mistake. But no one picked up. Even then, I was desperately trying to reassure myself, telling my heart that he was going to be fine, that he was just injured. But the exact moment I arrived at the hospital, they had already pulled a white sheet over his face. It's a violent realization when you never had a chance to say goodbye. 1 minute you're sitting across from them having breakfast, and a few hours later, they are lying perfectly still beneath a cold white sheet. When I reached out to pull that sheet down, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely move them. Owen lay there, his face completely pale, his lips blue, and construction dust still trapped in his hair. But what haunts me to this day, what keeps me awake every single night, were his eyes. They weren't fully closed. It looked as if, right before he died, he had seen something absolutely terrifying. In my line of work, I've seen my share of crime scenes and accidents. People who die in routine workplace mishaps don't look like that. Owen's expression didn't belong to a man who made a careless mistake. It belonged to a man who knew exactly what was coming for him. And every time I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. For a veteran engineer with over a decade of experience, an accidental shock would trigger a reaction of sudden surprise. But pure, paralyzing terror? That implies he saw the danger coming and was tracked. For the first few days, I tried to convince myself that I was just grieving and letting my imagination run wild. The construction company's report was straightforward. Owen was electrocuted while inspecting a secondary breaker panel. The local police filed the report and ruled it a tragic workplace accident. On paper, it was perfect. An electrical engineer dying of electrocution, no one questions that. But as the days went by, pieces of the puzzle stopped fitting, especially the company's behavior. They were pushing us so hard to hurry the funeral along. They kept bringing up compensation, insurance payouts, and covering all the funeral costs. It sounded incredibly generous on the surface, but it felt wrong. It felt like they wanted him buried and the case closed as fast as humanly possible. At the time, I couldn't focus on it because I was trying to hold my family together. Owen's mother completely collapsed. She fainted right in front of his casket. She had only ever had Owen. His father passed away when he was just a boy, and she worked endless odd jobs just to put him through college. Owen loved her fiercely. He used to hand over almost his entire paycheck to her. So when she saw her only son lying in that casket, she literally couldn't stand. One afternoon, during the wake, she caught sight of Owen's old work jacket hanging near the door. She just burst into hysterical tears, hugging that dusty jacket tightly to her chest, screaming his name over and over. Standing next to her, my knees went weak. It felt like the entire house was sinking into a black hole. And right when the chaos was at its peak, Caleb showed up. He was Owen's closest friend from the company, a man Owen had shared a decade of friendship with. Caleb was actually the best man at our wedding. Normally, the three of us would grab street food and sit talking until past midnight every single weekend. Caleb was the charismatic, smooth-talking one with tons of connections, while Owen was quiet, gentle, and strictly by the book. I used to joke that it was a miracle two such opposite people were best friends. I practically considered him family. On the day of the accident, he was the first person to arrive at the hospital right after me. When he saw Owen's body, he froze for what felt like an eternity. Then, out of nowhere, he punched the concrete wall so hard his knuckles bled, repeatedly muttering, "Why, Owen? Why did it have to be him?" To be honest, I felt immensely grateful for Caleb at the time. He handled almost all the funeral arrangements for us. He stayed up for days with my family, ran out to get medication for Owen's mother at 3 a.m. in the pouring rain when she couldn't breathe, and managed all the paperwork and guests. Everyone praised him for being such a loyal, stand-up friend, and I believed it too. Until I started noticing some very bizarre things about him. At first, it was just a gut feeling, something so subtle that I actually felt guilty for even thinking it. On the evening after the burial, once the crowd finally cleared out, I stood alone in front of Owen's memorial altar for a long time. Caleb was standing right there next to me, staring at Owen's photograph. Initially, I thought he was just heartbroken, but the longer I watched him, the colder I felt. Everyone else who walked up to that photo either burst into tears or bowed their head. But Caleb's gaze was entirely different. It wasn't sorrowful. It was deep, tense, and heavily calculating. It looked like his mind was violently racing, consumed by something entirely different. The terrifying part was that I couldn't comprehend why my instincts were screaming at me like that. Then, out of nowhere, he looked at Owen's photo and asked me, "Do you ever blame Owen?" I snapped my head up to look at him because the question was just so bizarre. I thought I had misheard him. Who asks a grieving widow at her husband's wake if she blames him? When I demanded to know what he meant, he went quiet for a moment, then muttered, "Owen always had a way of taking on too much. There were things he should have just stayed out of." At the time, I brushed it off, thinking he was just speaking out of grief. But looking back, that sentence chills me to the bone. It sounded like Caleb possessed first-hand knowledge of whatever danger Owen had stumbled into. Caleb didn't look like a man mourning a brother. He looked like a man sweating over a ticking time bomb. And the anomalies only multiplied. Around 1 a.m. one night, I went down to the kitchen to grab a glass of water and caught Caleb out in the yard on his phone. He was speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper. I distinctly overheard him say, "It's not safe right now. Wait a few days," followed by, "Stop calling me." When he turned around and saw me standing there, he flinched violently. He cut the call instantly, forced a smile, and claimed it was just a demanding subcontractor. I did impress him, but because of my line of work, my brain automatically locks those micro-reactions. Then came the final evening before the funeral. I was sitting in the kitchen, unable to swallow even a single spoonful of soup. Caleb walked in, set a hot cup of tea in front of me and said, "If Owen saw you like this, he wouldn't be able to rest in peace." It sounds like a normal, comforting thing to say, right? But I was watching his face. He looked utterly exhausted, but not from crying. It was the crushing anxiety of a man carrying a massive secret for far too long. I actually felt guilty at the time, reprimanding myself for overanalyzing a friend who was doing everything to help my family. But intuition is a funny thing. The more you try to suffocate it, the louder it screams. Caleb's actions were almost too perfect, too orchestrated, always appearing exactly where he needed to be. And when someone fits the role of a savior that flawlessly, you stop looking at them closely. I still didn't suspect he was directly involved. It was just a nameless, suffocating dread. But then came the burial. By late afternoon, the cemetery had cleared out. I lingered behind the crowd to catch one last glimpse of Owen's grave. As I walked past the floral arrangements, I spotted Caleb standing entirely alone in front of Owen's framed portrait. There was no one around to perform for. He just stood there, completely still. And the look on his face is something I will never forget. It was freezing cold. For the first time in my life, looking at a man I had known for over a decade gave me literal goosebumps. In that split second, the loyal best friend completely vanished. I was looking at a total stranger. I didn't realize back then that the look in his eyes would haunt me for months to come. The hardest part of grief for a survivor isn't the crying or the struggle to move on. It's the suffocating weight of an unanswered question. On paper, everything about Owen's case was clear-cut. A workplace accident, a signed and sealed police report, a perfectly logical cause of death. But sometimes, when a story is too perfect, it only fuels your suspicion. It was that exact gnawing doubt that drove me back to the construction site just 2 days after the funeral. I didn't go there planning to launch a full investigation. I just wanted to see the place where Owen took his last breath. My mind simply refused to accept that a man as meticulous as my husband could make a rookie mistake and die of electrocution. But my brain is wired for this. Years in financial crimes mean my eyes automatically zero in on anomalies. The moment I walked onto that site, the entire atmosphere felt off. It was a bleak, overcast day. The heavy machinery was roaring, drills were screeching, and laborers were moving back and forth. But as soon as they noticed me, the noise among the crew died down. Some of them literally turned their backs and walked away. I was in civilian clothes, but they knew exactly who I was. Owen's widow. A site manager named Derek came out to greet me. I had briefly met him at the hospital. He was smooth, overly polite, but the more he talked, the more my stomach churned. He didn't care about my grief or how Owen's mother was doing. Instead, he kept aggressively steering the conversation toward corporate compliance. He kept repeating how much the company had covered, how seamlessly they had coordinated the payouts, and how every single box had been checked. It felt less like a condolence and more like a corporate shield, desperate to establish that they owed us nothing more. They weren't comforting a widow. They were running damage control to bury a scandal. Derek led me to the exact spot where it happened, a secondary breaker panel tucked away at the back of the main warehouse. The area was surrounded by loose wiring and half-finished construction materials. Derek explained that there had been a sudden power fluctuation that morning, so Owen went down to inspect the main panel and was electrocuted instantly. It sounded textbook, but when I looked down, my blood ran cold. The scene was clean. It was unnaturally, surgically clean. A catastrophic workplace accident leaves a chaotic footprint. This spot looked like it had been scrubbed down by a hazmat team. I knelt down to examine the wiring near the base of the breaker panel. And that's when I saw it. A severed cable. The edge wasn't blown out from an electrical surge, and it wasn't frayed from wear and tear. It had a clean, deliberate edge. It looked like it had been sliced with a utility knife. I'm not an engineer, but after 10 years with Owen, I've learned the basics. He used to show me the difference between a wire fried by an overloaded circuit and one damaged by external tampering. The cable at that scene did not fail naturally. It was sabotaged. A veteran engineer dying of a freak accident is highly improbable. But a meticulously cleaned scene with a deliberately severed wire? That is a crime scene. In cases like this, the most terrifying element isn't the evidence left behind. It's the evidence that mysteriously vanishes right on cue. And that's exactly what happened next. I looked up and asked Derek where the security cameras for this specific sector were. The second the word camera left my mouth, his face completely drained of color. It was incredibly brief, but I caught it. He cleared his throat and told me that the entire surveillance system had suffered a critical error exactly during the window of Owen's accident. It was so insultingly lazy. An entire state-of-the-art industrial security system goes dark at the exact moment a senior engineer is killed? I asked him when the footage was lost. He claimed the IT department was in the middle of extracting data when a system-wide glitch wiped the server, making recovery impossible. I told him I just wanted to look at the logs from right before and right after that window. He quickly covered, claiming he'd email them to me later because the server was undergoing emergency maintenance. But to this very day, I have never received a single second of that footage. A single coincidence is just a fluke, but when a surveillance blackout, a wiped server, an unnaturally scrubbed scene, and a defensive manager all line up at the exact same time, it stops being a tragedy. It becomes a calculated cleanup. But the most damning evidence on that site wasn't the dead cameras, it was the living witnesses. The crew was what truly shattered my composure. As I stood near that breaker panel, I noticed several laborers staring at me. It was a look of desperate urgency, like they were dying to tell me something. But every time I made eye contact or took a step in their direction, they'd immediately freeze and look away. There was this one young worker standing a few feet away, so visibly anxious that his hands were shaking. He tried to light a cigarette and dropped it twice. I walked up and asked him directly if he was on shift the morning Owen died. He glanced around nervously and nodded, but before he could utter a single word, Derek aggressively cut in. He answered for him, loudly stating that the entire crew was in such a state of shock that morning that nobody could remember anything clearly. The second Derek said that, the entire group went dead silent. They wouldn't even look at me anymore. They weren't just avoiding a difficult conversation, they were terrified. They weren't staying quiet to protect the company. They were staying quiet because they feared the consequences of telling the truth. I realized right then that Owen's death was a cover-up. But the absolute chilling climax happened as I was leaving the site around noon. I was walking past the designated smoking area behind the main warehouse when I heard a faint, desperate whisper. "Hannah." I spun around. It was the young laborer from before. He was walking briskly toward me, his eyes frantically darting left and right, his face completely bloodless. He didn't stop walking. As he passed right by my shoulder, he muttered just one sentence. "You need to investigate this yourself." Before I could even open my mouth, he vanished into the main building. My heart pounded so violently against my ribs, I thought it would burst. It was the definitive confirmation I needed. A crime had been committed. That night, I sat in total darkness in front of Owen's portrait. The pieces of the last few months began violently colliding in my head. Once the corporate lie was stripped away, my mind forced me to look back at Owen's behavior before the accident. The sudden insomnia, the late-night phone calls, the way he kept checking his rear-view mirror as if he was being hunted. And then, a specific memory hit me like a physical blow. A few weeks ago, Owen was sitting out on the balcony alone at midnight, smoking. I walked out and asked him why he had been so incredibly tense lately. He didn't look at me. He just stared into the dark and whispered, There are some things in this world where the more you know, the more dangerous it becomes. At the time, I thought it was just job stress. Now, remembering it makes my skin crawl. The crumbs of a looming disaster were scattered across our daily life, but I didn't know how to decode them until it was too late. I haven't slept a full night since that visit to the site. During the day, I force a smile and play the strong daughter-in-law to keep Owen's mother grounded. But the second darkness falls, my mind becomes an interrogation room. I map out every single shift in Owen's behavior over the last 3 months. He had changed completely. Owen used to sleep like a baby. He'd come home exhausted from working the grid all day, hit the pillow, and knock out. But lately, I would wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. and the bed next to me would be freezing cold. I'd look out the window and there he'd be on the balcony, chain smoking in the dark.
And Owen wasn't even a smoker.
There were nights when I finally stepped out onto the balcony and the floor beneath his chair was already littered with cigarette butts. Owen would just sit there in absolute silence, staring down at the empty street for hours. At the time, I brushed it off. I told myself it was just standard job stress, the crushing weight of a heavy workload. But looking back at the memory now, the way he stared into the dark wasn't the look of a man who was just tired. It was the look of a man who was terrified. A man who knew with absolute certainty that something horrific was coming for him. Normal stress makes a man irritable or exhausted. But when someone completely stops sleeping, when they spend consecutive nights awake, watching the shadows like they're waiting for an ambush, that is a man living in a state of hypervigilance. His mind literally refused to let its guard down. And that kind of paralyzing fear doesn't just appear out of thin air.
It wasn't just the insomnia either.
Owen started exhibiting these unsettling, volatile micro-reactions. The glancing over his shoulder was the worst. We'd be out having a quiet dinner together, and he would constantly turn his head to scan the room. In the middle of a sentence, he'd suddenly go dead silent, locking his eyes on the space right behind my back for what felt like an eternity. I'd instinctively spin around to see if he'd spotted someone we knew, but there was never anyone there. When I'd ask him what he was looking at, he'd force this incredibly tight, hollow smile and say, "Nothing, honey. I'm just exhausted. My mind is playing tricks on me." It was a textbook lie, meant to just shut down the conversation. Then came the night terrors. He would bolt upright in bed in the dead of night, gasping for air so violently that it would wake me up in a panic. His skin would be completely drenched in cold sweat. I'd hold him and ask if he'd had a nightmare, and he would just sit there, chest heaving, nodding slowly in the dark. But whenever I pressed him on what he saw in the dream, he shut down and refused to answer. I still blame myself for being so blind. I still beat myself up every single day, asking why I didn't see how profoundly unstable his world had become. But I know how men like Owen operate. When they stumble into something catastrophic, they bury it deep. They hide it from their wives and children because, for a man like him, admitting he was terrified was far harder than quietly enduring the terror alone. He was desperately trying to keep a firewall between the danger he was facing and the family he loved. A man only shifts from stress to pure panic when he realizes the threat is no longer contained to just him. The warning signs became impossible to ignore About a month before the accident, when Owen suddenly announced he wanted to quit. It completely caught me off guard. He lived for his work, no matter how brutal the hours on the grid were. He had never once complained or talked about walking away. On top of that, the project he was managing paid incredibly well. He had literally just promised me that once this contract wrapped up, we'd finally have enough saved to buy me a new car. But one evening, right in the middle of dinner, he dropped his fork, looked at me, and said, "What would you think if I walked away from this site, right now?" I thought he was joking. I asked him why on earth he'd quit out of nowhere. Owen stared at his plate for a long time, went entirely quiet, and then muttered, "Something is wrong out there. I don't feel safe." When I demanded to know what wasn't safe, he locked up. He wouldn't give me a single detail. I actually lost my temper with him. I told him that I couldn't understand him when he kept speaking in riddles. He just looked at me and offered this weak, heartbreaking smile. It's the kind of smile that ruins me when I think about it now. It was the expression of a man who desperately wanted to scream the entire truth, but was too terrified of the fallout to let a single word escape. When a meticulous, level-headed man who has spent over a decade building a career suddenly wants to drop everything and run, it means his instincts are screaming at him to escape. He saw something that stripped away every ounce of his security. And he didn't stay quiet because he didn't trust me. He stayed quiet because he knew that telling me the truth would pull a target onto my back. Ever since the funeral, my mind has been aggressively recontextualizing every normal daily event into a glowing red flag, especially his phone. Owen used to be incredibly careless with it. He'd toss it on the kitchen counter, leave it face up on the coffee table, and I knew his passcode by heart. But a month before he died, he suddenly changed the lock. I remember teasing him about it, laughing and asking if he had a secret girlfriend he was hiding from me. He just forced a laugh and moved on. But from that exact day forward, that phone never left his person. If he was asleep and the phone merely vibrated on the nightstand, he would bolt awake like a lightning strike, grab the device, and sprint out to the balcony to answer it. When he'd come back inside, his face would be entirely bloodless. I'd ask him who was calling at 3 a.m., and he'd avoid my gaze entirely, muttering that it was just a crisis at the construction site. I was genuinely furious back then because we had never kept secrets from each other. I finally cornered him one evening. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Owen, stop lying to me. You are in deep trouble, aren't you?" He sat in absolute silence for what felt like minutes. Then, out of nowhere, he reached out and pulled me into his arms. He held me so incredibly tight it actually hurt. His chest was shaking. And then he whispered that exact line into my hair, the line that gives me literal goosebumps every time it echoes in my head. "If anything ever happens to me, Hannah, promise me you won't dig too deep." I blew up at him. I snapped at him for saying such morbid, ridiculous things, but he just shut down and refused to elaborate. Now I realize the agonizing truth. He wasn't being dramatic. He was actively trying to prepare me for his death. He was drowning under a massive, invisible pressure, a nightmare he couldn't share, a cry for help he couldn't make, and a world where he realized he couldn't trust a single living soul. But the memory that absolutely paralyzes me happened a few weeks later. Owen had gotten completely drunk. Caleb had come over to the house, and the three of us were sitting around the table, having beers and hot pot just like we always did. At first, it felt completely normal. The two of them were laughing, talking about the project, arguing about football, just regular guy stuff. But as the night wore on, I noticed Owen was drinking aggressively, knocking back beers like he was desperately trying to black out as fast as humanly possible. Caleb actually tried to slow him down and stop him a few times, but by midnight, Owen was completely wasted. I managed to haul him into the bedroom and lay him down on the mattress. As I tried to pull the blanket over him, he suddenly reached out and clamped his hand around my wrist. His grip was vice-like. His eyes were completely bloodshot, swimming with tears, and he stared up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He looked right into my soul and whispered, "Hannah, I'm scared I won't survive until the end of the year." My blood went entirely cold. At the time, I panicked, thinking he had been diagnosed with a terminal illness and was hiding it from me. I had no idea that the disease killing my husband wasn't medical. It was standing right outside our bedroom door. I demanded to know what he meant by that, but he just shook his head, forced a slurred laugh, and muttered that he was just completely wasted. The next morning, when he sobered up, I brought it up again. He immediately brushed it off, laughing it away, and claiming that when he drinks too much, he just talks absolute nonsense. But deep down, I knew. A man doesn't just casually predict his own death before the end of the year out of nowhere. Especially not a man like Owen. The more I replay that moment in my head, the more I realize how consumed by fear he actually was. He was so terrified that even when the alcohol dropped his defenses, the terror was the first thing that spilled out of his mouth. When a man is sober, he can lock his secrets in a vault, but when he's drunk, his survival reflex takes over. He didn't lock up because he was joking. He locked up because he realized he had dangerously said too much. For days after my visit to the construction site, those memories played on a violent loop in my mind. The more the pieces connected, the more I realized Owen spent his final weeks like a death row inmate waiting for the executioner. And the most agonizing part, I was completely, utterly oblivious. I spent consecutive nights sitting alone in front of his memorial altar until dawn, begging the silence for answers. What did my husband discover? Who was hunting him? Why did he have to carry this crushing weight all by himself? Everything violently shifted on the 7th night after the funeral. Once the web of anomalies finally connected, I stopped viewing Owen's death as a tragic workplace accident. My investigator instincts told me he had been trying to leave me a signal for a very long time. I just hadn't known how to read the transmission. And on that 7th night, the signal finally broke through. I drove back to our old studio apartment. Initially, I had no intention of going there, but the air at his mother's house was thick with relentless sobbing, and being surrounded by crowds of comforting relatives was making me feel claustrophobic. My mind was a war zone of unanswered questions. Around 9 p.m., I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I stood frozen in the entryway for an eternity. Everything was exactly as Owen had left it. His slippers were still sitting neatly by the door. His heavy work jacket was draped over the back of the chair. A half-empty coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter. When someone is alive, you never notice these mundane little details. But the second they are gone, those exact objects become weapons that rip your heart to shreds. The apartment still carried his scent. It felt warm, like a living space. For a split second, I had this overwhelming delusion that if I just waited a few more minutes, he would walk through the door, kick off his shoes, and smile at me. But then my eyes drifted to the empty side of the bed, and reality hit me like a physical blow. He was never coming back. That is the true cruelty of sudden loss. The old habits remain completely intact, but the human being is entirely erased. The jacket hangs there, the mark sits there. Everything remains frozen in time except for him. And it's those exact moments of absolute silence in an old room that cause you to completely deteriorate the fastest. It was freezing cold that night, and a steady, miserable drizzle was hitting the roof tiles. The apartment was so hauntingly quiet that the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounded deafening. When Owen was alive, even if we were sitting in total silence, the room felt safe and warm. That night, I finally understood the true definition of hollow, suffocating isolation. I sat out on the balcony for hours, occupying the exact plastic chair where Owen had spent his final weeks chain-smoking in the dark. I replayed every single red flag. The insomnia, the frantic midnight phone calls, the paranoid glances over his shoulder, the slurred confession. I'm scared I won't survive until the end of the year. It wasn't job stress. Owen had looked directly into the eyes of a looming threat, and he knew he couldn't outrun it. Around 2 a.m., I finally dragged myself inside and lay down on the mattress. But sleep was entirely out of the question. I just stared blankly at the ceiling, then turned my head to look at Owen's side of the bed. Out of pure, hardwired habit, I actually reached out my hand and started to whisper his name to wake him up. Then the realization crashed over me all over again. He's dead. It's over. It's an agonizing brand of pain that locks your throat. You can't even cry. I lay there paralyzed as the rain outside intensified, turning into a torrential downpour. The wind rattled the window frames, causing the curtains to sway violently. As the hours crept closer to dawn, the temperature in the room plummeted. Exhaustion finally won, and I drifted into a heavy, suffocating sleep. I don't know if what happened next was a spiritual encounter or just a violent manifestation of my traumatized subconscious. But when a person dies with a massive, unresolved truth trapped in their throat, they leave behind a residual energy that demands to be answered. When your mind is already drowning in suspicion, the most terrifying thing isn't seeing a ghost. It's the realization that you are standing inches away from a horrific truth. Suddenly, I woke up, but I couldn't move. My eyes snapped open, but my entire body felt like it was pinned to the mattress by an immense, crushing weight. Sleep paralysis. My mind was fully conscious, but I was completely locked in my own skin. I tried to scream, I tried to twitch a finger, but I was entirely paralyzed. That's when the atmosphere in the room shifted. A suffocating certainty washed over me. I was no longer alone. Someone was standing in the darkness, watching me. My heart violently battered against my ribs, and then I saw him. Owen was standing in the far corner of the bedroom, right next to the wardrobe. He was wearing the exact dusty construction uniform he had died in. His clothes were damp from the rain, his face was completely bloodless, and his lips were a bruised purple. But what froze the blood in my veins was his gaze. It was the exact expression from the hospital, paralyzed with agony, swimming in pure terror, desperately trying to communicate a message he couldn't speak aloud. I wanted to scream his name. I wanted to tear through the paralysis and fling myself into his arms, but I could only watch. Owen didn't say a word. He just locked his eyes onto mine, slowly raised his arm, and pointed his finger directly at the wall behind the wardrobe. He wasn't there to terrify me. It was the desperate, final transmission of a dying man. It was the absolute manifestation of a soul screaming for his loved one to understand something before it was lost forever. He just kept pointing at that wall, his eyes wild with urgency, as if he knew that if I didn't comprehend the signal right this second, the window would close permanently. My eyes tracked the direction of his finger, the wall behind the heavy wooden wardrobe. On the surface, it was just a blank piece of drywall. But then, a dormant memory violently sparked in my brain. About a month before his death, Owen had insisted on dragging that massive wardrobe across the room by himself, flushing it completely flat against that specific wall. I had asked him why he was rearranging the furniture out of nowhere, and he had casually brushed it off, claiming it was just to cover up a patch of damp drywall. Connecting it now, my skin broke out in a violent chill. As I stared desperately at that wall, Owen took 3 slow steps closer to the bed. He raised his arm higher, and that's when I saw his wrist. There was a massive, charred, black chemical burn circling his skin. It wasn't the clean exit wound of an accidental electrical shock. It was a violent, deep tissue chemical burn, like his flesh had been melted by something incredibly volatile. In that final fraction of a second, the terror in his eyes shifted. The grief vanished. He looked at me, his hand outstretched, and his face twisted into a desperate, silent scream for help. He kept pointing at the wall, his gestures growing faster, more frantic, like he was begging me to understand before his time ran out. And in that exact fraction of a second, I violently jolted awake, slamming my body upright in bed. My chest was heaving, my heart was hammering against my ribs, and my shirt was completely soaked in cold sweat. Outside, the downpour was still raging, and the bedroom was pitch black, saved only by the amber glow of the street lights bleeding through the cracks in the curtains. But what froze the air in my throat was the position. The exact corner where Owen had been standing in that nightmare was the dark gap right behind the heavy wooden wardrobe, not an inch off. I sat there in the dark for an eternity, violently forcing my brain into investigator mode. I'm a police officer. My entire career is built on logic, evidence, and hard facts. I don't believe in ghosts or spiritual premonitions. I tried to tell myself it was just a psychological projection, a brutal symptom of sleep deprivation and severe grief. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the less it worked. The experience had been too visceral, too real. The terror in Owen's eyes wasn't meant to haunt me. It was the look of a man demanding justice from beyond the grave. By the time I checked my phone, it was 3:12 a.m. The entire neighborhood was dead silent, drowning under the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Before my logical brain could talk me out of it, my feet hit the cold floor. I walked straight out to the balcony and grabbed Owen's old toolbox, pulling out his heavy iron maintenance hammer. Holding that cold steel in my hand, I knew I was acting completely unhinged. But a singular, driving thought overrode my sanity. If there is actually something hidden behind that drywall, then this was Owen's final legacy to me. I was going to tear that room apart. I stood in the center of the dark room, gripping that old iron hammer so tightly my knuckles turned white. My hands were shaking violently. I wasn't afraid of the supernatural. I was terrified of what logic dictated. If something was hidden in that wall, it meant every dark suspicion I had harbored about the construction company was an absolute, undeniable reality. I grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden wardrobe and dragged it forward. The legs screeched sharply against the tiled floor, a deafening sound in the middle of the night. I froze for a few seconds, terrified the neighbors would hear the commotion. But then, a realization washed over me. If I walked back to bed right now, I would never sleep another night for the rest of my life. I took a deep, steadying breath, raised the hammer, and swung. The first strike was hesitant. A dull, hollow thud echoed through the room. A tiny flake of paint chipped off the drywall, but nothing happened. For a split second, I felt utterly ridiculous. A seasoned financial crimes investigator, breaking down a bedroom wall at 3 in the morning based entirely on a bad dream. If my colleagues saw me right now, they'd have me committed. But then, the mental image of Owen standing in that corner flashed back into my mind. The suffocating urgency in his gaze, the way his scarred wrist pointed relentlessly at the drywall. It was an anchor I couldn't break free from. I gripped the handle with both hands and swung with everything I had. Crack, crack, crack. The heavy iron slammed into the drywall, the noise shattering the freezing air of the apartment. With every single impact, my pulse spiked. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the grip because the psychological weight of what I was doing finally crashed over me. A man doesn't secretly alter his apartment's architecture to bury a secret unless he knows with absolute certainty that he is running out of time. Owen had spent his final days on this earth under the shadow of his own execution, knowing he might never walk back through our front door. And while he was drowning in that isolation, I had been completely blind. I stopped thinking. I just kept swinging. After about a dozen heavy blows, the drywall fractured violently, spiders' webs of cracks spreading across the white surface. Gypsum dust erupted into the air, settling in my hair and sticking to the sweat pouring down my back. I brought the hammer down one last time, and the center of the wall completely caved in. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I thought the dust was playing tricks on my eyes, but as it settled, a hollow space revealed itself inside the partition wall. My hands went completely numb. The hammer slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the floor. He did it. He actually hit something. I dropped to my knees, aggressively tearing away the jagged shards of broken drywall with my bare hands. The sharp edges sliced into my skin, white dust mixing with the blood on my fingers, but I didn't feel a single ounce of pain. And then, my hand struck metal. Buried deep within the hollow cavity of the wall was a small, heavy grey steel utility box. Owen had wrapped it meticulously in multiple layers of thick industrial waterproof plastic, sealing it tight against moisture. It was buried deep in the skeletal frame of the building, waiting for me to find it. My heart was battering against my ribs so violently I could hear it echoing in my own ears. I knew, with absolute and terrifying certainty, that from this exact second onward, my life would never be the same. There are defining moments in your existence where you realize you are crossing a line of no return. Before I opened that steel box, I could still hide behind my corporate logic. I could still tell myself I was just a grieving, hypervigilant cop overthinking a tragedy. But the moment my fingers brushed that metal, the lie vanished. Owen hadn't made a mistake. He had built a vault into the bones of our home, and he had left the transmission waiting for me. The sheer reality of it paralyzed me. I collapsed onto the dusty floorboards, my entire body shaking so hard I couldn't even slide the latch open on the first try. But what choked the air out of my lungs wasn't the fear of what was inside. It was the sickening realization of what Owen must have felt while he was burying this. A regular man doesn't cut open his bedroom drywall to hide a toolbox. Only a man living under a death sentence. A man drowning in absolute, suffocating terror hides a secret like this. When the lid finally clicked open, my breath caught. It wasn't a chaotic mess. Everything was arranged with clinical, deliberate precision, like a piece of evidence catalogued for trial. Inside lay an old burner phone, a matte black USB drive, a small leather-bound notebook, and a stack of photographs sealed tightly inside a waterproof industrial Ziploc bag. He hadn't thrown this together in a panic. He had planned this layout months before his heart stopped beating. I reached into the box and pulled out the notebook first. The moment I opened the cover, my vision blurred. It was Owen's handwriting, unmistakable and sharp. But as my eyes scanned the first few pages, the room felt like it was losing oxygen. It wasn't a standard engineering log. It was a ledger of corruption. Dates, corporate names, financial figures totaling millions. And sprinkled between the data were short, frantic notes that made my blood freeze. Can't trust anyone at the main office. They are watching the perimeter. Keep the server files off-site. It read like the diary of a man tracking his own assassins. I was staring at a shadow investigation that my husband had conducted entirely alone in the dark. And the guilt of that realization hit me like a physical blow. All those weeks he spent pacing the balcony, losing sleep, drowning in a nightmare, and I had dismissed it as job stress. I had actually grown resentful because he changed his passcode. Tears of pure agony cut through the gypsum dust on my face because I finally understood how utterly, profoundly isolated he was. He had looked around his life, looked at his colleagues, looked at his friends, and realized there wasn't a single living soul he could trust to keep him alive. The photos inside the plastic sleeve only solidified the horror. There were surveillance shots of the construction grid. Some targeted the exact secondary breaker panel where his body was found. Others were high-resolution prints of corporate invoices, and a few were long-lens shots of men meeting covertly at an upscale cafe downtown. It was a complete case file. He had left a breadcrumb trail in the drywall, not out of a desire for vengeance, but as an insurance policy. He wanted to ensure that if they finally silenced him, he wouldn't disappear into a statistics column. He wanted me to know he hadn't died for nothing. My focus slowly drifted to the object at the bottom of the box, the burner phone. It was an old cheap flip phone, the kind that can't be tracked by modern software. The fact that Owen used something so archaic was a testament to how dangerous his reality had been. I picked it up, my fingers trembling against the cheap plastic. To my shock, the battery indicator showed it was fully charged, meaning Owen had been meticulously maintaining it right up until his final morning. I knew that pressing the power button meant shattering the illusion of safety forever. Once the machine booted up, there would be no turning back. I took a ragged breath and hit the key. The screen flickered to life, its low-resolution glow piercing the darkness of the bedroom. And then, the home screen loaded, and my breath completely trapped itself in my throat. The wallpaper was a photo of the two of us. It was taken 3 years ago during a weekend getaway to the mountains. We were standing on a ridge, laughing into the wind, looking like two people who had their entire lives ahead of them. But what made my skin turn to ice, what made a violent shiver race down my spine, was remembering who took that photograph. Caleb. Caleb had taken that picture. He was standing right behind the lens, smiling at us while we laughed. Seeing his phantom presence attached to Owen's final secret made the entire universe feel distorted and sinister. The phone didn't have any apps. It was completely stripped down, modified solely to record audio logs and store hidden data files. The trapdoors of the mystery were finally swinging open, and as I sat there in the dark at 3 a.m., looking at the glowing screen, I realized the monster Owen had been running from wasn't a faceless corporation. It was someone who had sat at our dinner table. The first folder I clicked on was filled with audio logs. There were over 20 files, all catalogued meticulously by date. My fingers were shaking so violently against the screen because I knew Owen. He was the kind of man who hated taking videos or voice notes. If he went through the trouble of secretly recording these people, it meant he was actively building a criminal case file. I tapped the oldest file. At first, there was only background noise, the faint hum of an office fan, the clink of a coffee mug being set onto a desk. Then, two male voices broke the silence. They were speaking in hushed, urgent whispers, discussing the logistics of the construction grid. The volume was low, but as the seconds ticked by, a heavy chill settled into my chest. They were discussing corporate sabotage and fraud. They openly talked about swapping out high-grade materials for cheap, counterfeit substitutes, shorting the wiring layouts, and altering the official inspector logs to cover their tracks if an audit happened. I had to pause the audio halfway through just to force air back into my lungs. My mind was reeling. Owen hadn't stumbled into a routine workplace hazard. He had discovered something he was never supposed to see. I forced myself to play the remaining files one by one, each more damning than the last. Some were recorded in noisy bars, others directly on the active construction site, with the phone clearly hidden in his breast pocket. The audio was muffled, but the words cut through the static like a knife. In one recording, a voice sharply muttered, "We can't let this leak. Owen knows too much." Hearing his name uttered by those shadows gave me literal goosebumps. The vague suspicion that had been haunting me since the hospital was no longer a theory. It was an absolute, terrifying reality. My husband had been hunted. Next, I plugged the matte black USB drive into my laptop. It was a gold mine of evidence, schematics, modified technical blueprints, banking transaction receipts, and lists of fraudulent material suppliers. He had even taken macro photographs of the substandard wiring panels before they were sealed behind the drywall. And the most horrific part? Every single compromised component was directly tied to the primary electrical safety grid. If those panels failed, it wouldn't just cause a blackout, it would trigger a lethal, catastrophic surge. I sat frozen on the floor, staring at the screen, completely unable to comprehend how Owen had carried this crushing weight all by himself. He had waded through this nightmare every day, yet he still came home, sat across from me at dinner, and smiled as if his world wasn't collapsing. He lived on the edge of a blade, knowing that a single misstep would cost him his life. The puzzle of his final weeks finally clicked into place. The sudden insomnia, the desperate urge to quit his job, the paranoia, the locked phone. It wasn't stress. It was the survival reflex of a man who realized he was completely cornered. And the clarity only made the grief more agonizing because I realized how profoundly, utterly alone my husband had been in his final days. My investigator instincts completely took over when I opened a file labeled Ledger. It was a massive Excel sheet documenting millions of dollars in illicit kickbacks, routed through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The numbers were staggering, all directly tied to the infrastructure project Owen was managing. This wasn't small-time corporate theft. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar syndicate. Then, my eyes locked onto a tiny folder at the bottom of the directory. The title was a single word: Emergency. My blood went entirely cold. That wasn't how Owen organized his files. I clicked it open to find a solitary Word document. It was brief, just a few lines of text, but the moment I read his words, the room spun. Owen had written, "Hannah, if you are reading this, it means they found out, and I didn't make it home. I am so sorry for keeping you in the dark. I didn't know who I could trust anymore." Right there, on the cold floor surrounded by drywall dust, I completely broke down. The tears finally came, hot and relentless, because for the first time, I felt the sheer, suffocating weight of his desperation right before he died. He was drowning, looking at the people around him, looking at his colleagues, looking at his friends, and realizing that in his entire universe, there wasn't a single person left he could trust to keep him alive. When a man types out a sentence like that, he has already been backed into a corner of absolute suffocating isolation. He knows the danger is close enough to breathe down his neck. He knows his entire circle might be constructed of lies, but he refuses to drag the woman he loves into the blast radius. As I forced my eyes to keep reading through Owen's ledger, the chill in my bones grew completely paralyzing. The notebook was a graveyard of names: site supervisors, corporate material suppliers, logistics managers, half of them individuals I had never even heard of. Beside every single name, Owen had left a tight clinical micronote: untrustworthy, directly tied to Shell account transfers, present at the off-site briefing. And then I turned to the final page. My hand froze mid-air. My mind went completely blank for what felt like eternity. I stared at the ink, desperately praying that it was a typo, a glitch, a case of mistaken identity. But it wasn't. Written in sharp, heavy strokes was the name: Caleb Vance. Right beneath his name, Owen had written a solitary, haunting sentence: "He knows significantly more than he lets on." My pulse violently spiked. In a fraction of a second, a montage of Caleb played in my head. The hollow look in his eyes at the memorial service, the frantic, hushed phone call in our yard at 1 a.m., the calculated perfection of his timing, always appearing exactly where he needed to be to manage our family. The pieces were colliding, and the picture they formed was terrifying. Yet, a desperate part of me still refused to believe it. This was Caleb, Owen's brother for over 10 years, the man who orchestrated the funeral, who stayed up until 3 a.m. running through the pouring rain to buy medication for Owen's collapsing mother. I couldn't accept that he was a monster. Not until I clicked on the final audio file. The weight of that moment was suffocating. Owen hadn't just been tracking a corporate conspiracy. He had realized that the snake was already sleeping inside his own house.
The worst betrayal doesn't come from an enemy you see coming. It comes from the person standing right next to you, holding your hand while you bleed. This final recording was timestamped exactly 2 days before Owen's death. When the audio started, the speaker filled the dark bedroom with the loud, rushing sound of a car engine and wind tearing past windows. Owen was driving. A few seconds later, the engine cut out. The heavy thud of a car door slamming shut echoed, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Then, a second man spoke. The moment that voice bled through my laptop speakers, my entire body went entirely rigid. The room felt freezing cold. I recognized the voice instantly. It was Caleb. It was a total psychological demolition. The man who had been the savior of my household, the pillar of strength for Owen's grieving mother, was standing in the shadows of a secret recording left behind by the victim. There was no mistaking it. Caleb has this very distinct, slightly raspy, slow cadence when he speaks, but the voice on that tape didn't belong to the loyal best friend I knew. The warmth was entirely erased. It was freezing, clinical, and sharp with lethal impatience. Owen spoke first. His voice sounded thin, exhausted, pushed to the absolute edge. He asked, "Why does it have to go this far, Caleb?" There was a torturous, dead silence on the tape for a few seconds. Then, Caleb's voice cut back in. "Because you know too much, Owen." Hearing those words, my hands went completely numb. The entire puzzle of Owen's final weeks dissolved into a terrifying clarity. The sudden insomnia, the frantic midnight phone calls, the paranoia, the hidden vault in the drywall. This was why. The chill of that recording didn't come from a loud, violent argument. It was the terrifyingly quiet contrast between two old friends. One man was desperately begging to hold on to the final shreds of his conscience, while the other had already walked so far into the dark that he was completely hollowed out. Owen was entirely alone. He had uncovered a multi-million-dollar conspiracy, only to realize the architect of the nightmare was the guy he called his brother. I could barely swallow as the tape kept rolling. Owen's voice grew shakingly intense. "Someone is going to get killed, Caleb. If you keep swapping out the high-voltage safety regulators for these cheap counterfeit components, the entire grid is going to blow. It's a death trap." And then Caleb laughed. It was a tiny, low chuckle, but it is a sound that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. He murmured, "We've been running this layout for years, Owen. Nobody has died yet." I sat there in the dark, utterly paralyzed. The syndicate wasn't a recent development. It was a well-oiled machine that had been operating in the dark for years. And Caleb wasn't just a low-level accomplice. He was buried at the very center of the corruption. On the tape, Owen's voice hardened into a desperate line. "I can't keep my eyes closed anymore. I'm going to the authorities." Caleb didn't miss a beat. His voice dropped to a freezing, venomous whisper. "Then what, Owen? You want to die along with this project?"
The threat was so explicit, so lethal, I almost dropped the phone right out of my hands. When a monster is talking to someone he thinks he completely controls, the mask doesn't just slip, it falls away entirely. The most chilling part of that recording was the complete terrifying absence of any brotherhood. Caleb didn't sound like an old college friend or a partner. He sounded like a corporate executive managing a high-stakes liability. And the liability was his best friend. I finally understood the absolute depth of Owen's despair before he died.
He hadn't just discovered a lethal corporate crime. He had discovered that the architect of the nightmare was the man he called a brother.
But do you want to know what breaks my heart the most, Bella? Even on that tape, trapped on the edge of a blade, Owen was still trying to save him. At one point, his voice cracked and he practically begged, "Just stop it, Caleb. You can still turn this around. It's not too late to walk away." I sat there in the dark, crying uncontrollably. Even when his life was actively being threatened, Owen was thinking about his friend's soul. He was trying to pull him back from the edge of the cliff. But Caleb was already completely hollowed out. He replied with a sentence that has nested inside my head like a disease. "Nobody in this world is clean, Owen. Not me, and certainly not you." Hearing that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the voice of a normal human being anymore.
It belonged to someone who had completely detached from morality. Someone who had given himself total permission to destroy anything or anyone standing between him and what he wanted. Owen didn't just lose his life that day. He had to watch his brother die before he was even killed. Sometimes, the betrayal is what executes you first. Once the audio cut to static, my mind began aggressively rebuilding the entire funeral. Every micro-expression, every hollow word of comfort Caleb offered over those 3 days, it all replayed in a horrific new light. I remembered him standing alone at dusk in front of Owen's memorial altar, staring at the photograph. I had brushed it off as grief, but looking back through the lens of this tape, he wasn't mourning. He was checking his work. He was staring at that photo, calculating whether his dark secret had been successfully buried 6 feet under, along with the body. Then I remembered catching him on the phone in our yard at 1 a.m., frantically whispering, "Wait a few days." He wasn't talking to a subcontractor. He was running damage control. He was likely searching for the exact evidence Owen had managed to extract. If I hadn't taken that iron hammer to the drywall tonight, everything Owen sacrificed his life to protect would have vanished into the shadows forever. The most terrifying monsters in this world aren't the ones who scream or show their teeth. It's the ones who can look you dead in the eye, orchestrate a tragedy, and then seamlessly step into the wreckage to play the grieving savior. The sheer, freezing calculation required for Caleb to carry Owen's collapsing mother inside, to manage the wake, to stay up for nights comforting me while knowing exactly how Owen's heart stopped beating. It implies a level of psychopathy that makes me physically sick. I had to shut the laptop screen halfway through. My mind was completely fracturing. On one side of my brain was the loyal, charismatic friend I had known for over a decade. On the other side was the venomous ghost on the tape. My subconscious violently refused to accept that they were the exact same person. But then, the investigator in me forced the pieces together. The anomalies were everywhere. The day of the accident, Caleb arrived at the hospital instantly, unusually fast, even beating the site managers who were supposedly working the same shift. And every single time over the last week that I mentioned wanting to visit the construction grid,
He had insisted on driving me. He kept whispering, "Don't torture yourself, Hannah. It was just a freak accident. You need to let it go." It wasn't comfort. It was a targeted psychological campaign to steer a police investigator away from a crime scene. When a betrayal goes that deep, it doesn't just break your heart. It completely poisons your memory. It retroactively corrupts every smile, every dinner, every shared laugh, until you don't know what part of your own life was actually real. But the absolute breaking point, the discovery that left me entirely paralyzed on the floor, happened when I moved past the audio logs and reopened the surveillance folder. Mixed in with the schematics and blueprints were hidden camera shots Owen had taken himself. There were photos of Caleb meeting individuals in tinted cars, handing over thick document portfolios. But then, I clicked on a file timestamped exactly 2 months ago, taken inside a crowded downtown cafe, and the breath completely died in my throat. In the background of the frame, Owen was sitting at a corner table, holding his phone up. But the central focus of the photograph was Caleb. He was sitting across the room, staring directly at me. I froze. My chest tightened until I couldn't breathe. I remembered that exact afternoon. I had been at that cafe meeting a colleague, but I had no idea Owen was there tracking him, and I had absolutely no clue Caleb was sitting in the shadows watching my every move. The look in Caleb's eyes in that photograph, it wasn't the gaze of a husband's best friend. It was something profoundly distorted, dark, unhinged. An obsessive, possessive stare that gave me literal goosebumps. And in that horrifying fraction of a second, the final, sickening layer of the puzzle fell into place. Caleb didn't just orchestrate Owen's murder for corporate greed or millions in a shell account. There are moments in an investigation where you uncover a truth so profoundly repulsive that your brain actively tries to reject it. Not just because it's violent, but because it forces you to realize that you have spent years sharing a life with a phantom. I had looked at this man for 3 years as an older brother, a trusted anchor who regularly came over for dinner, who helped us move, who always remembered to surprise me with a cake on my birthday before Owen, who was notoriously forgetful, could even think of it. I used to tell Owen how incredibly lucky we were to have a friend so deeply sentimental. But looking at that hidden photograph in the dead of night, with the rain violently thrashing against my window, every single memory warped into something grotesque. The birthday gifts, the constant check-ins, the suffocating warmth. It wasn't kindness. It was a calculated, patient siege. And as I sat there on the floor, covered in broken drywall and dust, the grief for my husband completely transmuted into pure, unadulterated terror. I wasn't just looking at the evidence of a corporate execution anymore. I was looking at the blueprint of a man who had cleared the only obstacle standing between him and me. That is the ultimate lingering horror of an obsession like this. It doesn't weaponize itself immediately. It doesn't show its teeth. Instead, it bleeds into your life slowly, camouflaged under the flawless veneer of warmth, loyalty, and brotherhood. By the time you finally look back, the boundaries of reality have been distorted for years. A terrifying amount of malice in this world has absolutely nothing to do with cash or leverage. It stems entirely from the bitter, suffocating envy of watching someone else occupy the exact existence you crave. Once I managed to force down the bile in my throat and steady my breathing, I turned back to the screen. Deep inside the directory of that black USB drive was a solitary folder protected by an encrypted password. Luckily, Owen had jotted down a sequence of characters in the margins of his leather notebook. I typed them in, the lock clicked open, and the moment the files populated the screen, I felt physically sick. It was a gallery of surveillance, dozens of high-resolution photographs of me. There were shots of me sitting at a cafe window, walking through the entrance of the precinct, loading groceries into my trunk in a supermarket parking lot. The sheer predatory nature of it paralyzed me. In almost every single frame, I was completely oblivious to the lens. Some shots were taken from a massive distance, utilizing a telephoto lens, likely through the tinted glass of a parked car. My hand shook so violently against the desk, I could no longer grip the mouse. I didn't need a forensic audit to identify the photographer. It was Caleb. No one else possessed that level of unrestricted, intimate proximity to my daily routine. I clicked out of the images and opened a text document tucked beside them. It wasn't written by Owen. It was a digital journal where Owen had systematically logged direct quotes from Caleb over the past year. One entry read, "Caleb got wasted tonight. He looked at me and asked, 'If I had met Hannah first, do you think things would be different?' Another log simply said, 'The way he looks at Hannah when she walks into the room, something is wrong. I don't feel safe.' Reading those lines, a wave of literal goosebumps erupted across my skin. Owen knew. My meticulous protective husband had discovered this sickness long before he was killed. I can't even begin to fathom the psychological torture Owen must have endured during his final months on Earth. He was trapped in a living hell. On one side was the woman he loved fiercely, and on the other was his brother of 10 years. He had to sit there, silent, watching a distorted, obsessive infatuation manifest in the person he trusted most, desperately fighting the urge to believe his own eyes. There is a brand of betrayal that doesn't require an explicit act of violence to tear your world apart. Simply realizing that your best friend is looking at your wife through the eyes of a predator is enough to break a man. Owen had been suffocating under this reality for a very long time. The proof was in the next file, an audio recording time-stamped a few months ago, captured secretly inside the enclosed cabin of Owen's truck. At first, it was just the mundane sounds of traffic and turn signals. They were discussing blueprints, arguing about standard construction logistics. But then, out of nowhere, Owen's voice cut through the cabin, low and deadly serious. "How long are you going to keep staring at my wife like that, Caleb?" The tape went dead silent for an agonizing stretch of time. Then, Caleb let out this hollow, deeply unsettling chuckle. His voice drifted through the speakers, dripping with a quiet, venomous irritation. "You think I want to feel like this, Owen?" Owen's voice sounded entirely depleted, fractured by absolute disappointment. "I treated you like a brother, man. You were family." But Caleb was completely done performing. His tone dropped all pretenses, sharpening into a line that will ring in my head until the day I die. "Everything I have ever wanted in my miserable life, Owen, you had it first." I sat frozen on the floorboards, the drywall dust swirling around me in the dark. That wasn't simple jealousy anymore. That was a lethal, radioactive resentment that had been cultivating in the dark for a decade. Some people can walk through life wearing a perfect smile, playing the supportive sidekick, while silently suffocating under the weight of their own perceived inferiority. That brand of malice doesn't explode overnight. It accumulates over years, tracking every promotion, every dollar, every fraction of happiness you achieve, until their broken psyche convinces them that your life is a commodity that was rightfully stolen from them. Once that line is crossed, the boundary between bitter envy and violent possession completely dissolves. Looking back now, the scales have entirely fallen from my eyes. I finally understand the sinister undertone of all those memories I used to think were completely innocent. We'd be out at a restaurant, celebrating a milestone, and Caleb would get a few beers in him, stare at our apartment building, and mutter, "Must be nice. Owen's life always works out better than mine." Owen would just laugh it off, slap him on the back, and tell him to go find a good woman and settle down. We all laughed. I laughed. But it wasn't a joke. Even back then, Caleb was looking at our home, looking at our marriage, and calculating the cost of a replacement. He didn't just want corporate payouts or insurance fraud. He wanted to strip Owen out of the equation entirely. He wanted his credentials, his authority, his home, and his place in my bed. That is the true apex of horror in this nightmare. It's not the corporate cover-up or the severed brake lines. It's the profound, terrifying rot inside the human mind. A man can sit across from his brother for 10 years, smile, raise a glass, and slowly convince himself that he is living a ghost life. That the woman, the career, the respect belong to him. When a delusion is fed for that long, it ceases to be a grievance. It becomes a total, consuming obsession. And when that brand of dynamic obsession collides with raw corporate greed, the human animal becomes capable of things that are absolutely monstrous. The true, devastating reality that completely broke me on that floor was realizing that Owen knew everything. He knew Caleb was tracking me. He knew about the distorted infatuation. And he knew about the massive multi-million-dollar fraud syndicate. Yet, he chose to bury the evidence in the drywall instead of turning his best friend in immediately. He was desperately stalling, holding on to a fraction of naive hope that his brother of 10 years would look him in the eye and choose to stop. On one of those later tapes, Owen's voice broke as he begged, "You can still turn this around, Caleb." He was trying to shield the very man who was actively calculating his death. But Caleb was already past the point of no return. His response on the tape was frozen. "There are no exit ramps left for me, Owen." Listening to that line in the dark, I knew he wasn't just talking about the shell accounts or the corporate wire fraud. He was talking about me. He had allowed his psychological rot to drive him into a labyrinth he had no intention of escaping. Caleb had retroactively stripped Owen of his humanity. My husband was no longer a brother. He was an obstacle. A final structural barrier standing between Caleb and the existence he believed he was entitled to occupy. And when a psychopath begins looking at his closest friend as an equation that needs to be cleared, the execution is just a matter of timing. I sat there in the debris of my bedroom floor, caught in a suffocating crossfire between pure heartbreak and visceral panic. The air in the room felt dangerously thin. A new, terrifying calculation entered my mind. What else did Caleb know? Did he know Owen had built this vault? Did he know I was sitting here in the drywall dust, logging into the USB drive? Was he outside the building right now, tracking my silhouette through the window? It was nearing dawn, but the shadows in the apartment felt heavier, tighter, like the room was closing in on me. And then, right on cue, my personal phone violently buzzed on the floorboards. It was a solitary text message from Caleb Vance. It read, "I need to see you. Right now. Meet me tonight." The timing was so aggressively precise it made my blood freeze. The message landed mere minutes after I had finished extracting Owen's final files. My mind immediately split into two lethal scenarios. Either he had no idea I had torn the wall apart and he was just trying to maintain his savior routine, or he knew exactly what was on my laptop and I was currently standing in a blind spot. But as I stared at the screen, a bizarre, absolute calm washed over me. It was the clinical detachment that hits you when you are backed so far into a corner that fear ceases to be a useful survival metric. The exhaustion of the night dissolved into cold focus. I looked up at Owen's portrait, looked at the dust on my bleeding fingers, and realized that if my husband had died to keep this transmission alive, I was not going to run. I texted him back. "Okay, let's meet." But I'm a major in financial crimes. I don't walk into an ambush without armor. Before I shut my laptop, I uploaded the entire archive, the audio logs, the banking blueprints, the surveillance photos, directly into the secure internal network of the Economic Crimes Division, set to auto-forward to my closest partner on the force. Then, I clipped a hidden digital wiretap beneath the collar of my jacket, checked my service weapon, and walked out into the rain. I knew that whatever happened at this meeting, the truth would not be buried a second time. Caleb chose a secluded riverside cafe on the edge of town. It was our spot. For years, the three of us would sit at the corner table by the water because Owen loved how quiet it was. The sheer audacity of his choice gave me literal goosebumps. When I stepped through the door, Caleb was already sitting in the booth. He was wearing his usual dark civilian shirt, his expression perfectly composed, looking exactly like the dependable family anchor who had carried Owen's mother through the wake. Unless you had heard the venom on that digital tape, you would look at this man and see nothing but an honorable friend. He tracked me as I slid into the opposite booth. His voice was casual, dripping with that slow, familiar warmth. "You look like you haven't slept a wink, Hannah." It was so normal, it was sickening. I kept my hands flat beneath the table, flipped the toggle on my hidden recorder, and looked him dead in the eye. I didn't waste time on a greeting. I just said, "You know everything about the warehouse project, don't you, Caleb?" It was a direct hit. For a microsecond, the mask fractured. The fake warmth evaporated from his face and his eyes went completely dark. When a man has spent a decade fabricating a lie, he genuinely believes his own performance is flawless. But when the truth calls them out by name, their instincts betray them before their tongue can form a defense. I wasn't sitting across from my husband's best friend anymore. I was looking at his executioner. He tried to recover, forcing a slight patronizing chuckle, asking me what kind of wild theories I was spinning, but I cut him off. I looked at him and said, "I found the vault, Caleb. I listened to the recordings. I heard your voice." The silence that followed was absolute. He didn't blink. He just sat there for 5 long seconds as the realization settled into his chest that the performance was over. Then he let out a long, slow sigh. It was the most disturbing transformation I have ever witnessed. The grief, the loyalty, the protective brother routine. It all slid off him like cheap paint, leaving nothing behind but a freezing, dead exhaustion. He leaned back in the booth, stared at me, and murmured, "Owen should have just stayed out of those files. He was never supposed to keep those logs, Hannah. There it was, the definitive confession. He didn't even try to deny it. I felt the skin on my neck tighten as I asked. The secondary breaker panel. It wasn't an accident, was it? Caleb offered this weak, tragic smile that made my stomach turn. He looked out at the river and whispered, "He chose his exit, Hannah. I gave him every opportunity to walk away." Hearing him rationalize the murder of his brother as a choice made my blood run cold. He had repeated the corporate lie in his own head for so long that his conscience had become completely warped. He genuinely believed he was the victim of Owen's stubbornness. And then the vault opened, and he started pouring out a decade of venom. He spoke with the frantic velocity of a man who had been suffocating under his own secrets for far too long. He told me Owen was an idiot, that if he had just kept his mouth shut and signed off on the logistics invoices, everyone would be rich and safe. He said the money floating through those shell accounts was too massive for any sane man to turn down. But then, the conversation veered away from the financials and his eyes locked onto mine. "I met you first, Hannah," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate, unhinged whisper. "I was the one who introduced you to him before the wedding, but he was always the one who ended up with everything." My heart completely dropped. I couldn't breathe. The sheer, terrifying scope of his resentment layout was fully exposed. For 10 years, Caleb Vance had been standing in our shadows, smiling at our dinners, carrying our groceries, while silently drowning in a radioactive envy. He hated Owen for his intellect, he hated him for his reputation, and he hated him for the woman who slept beside him. He leaned over the table, his gaze mimicking the exact obsessive stare from Owen's surveillance photos. "Owen always had the better hand," he muttered, his hands tightening into fists. "He was the star engineer. He was the one the executives trusted. He had the perfect home. If Owen wasn't in the frame, everything would have been different. The layout would have been mine." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Owen's execution wasn't just a corporate cleanup to protect a fraud syndicate. He was an obstacle that needed to be cleared so Caleb could step into his skin. He wanted his life, his career, his house, and he wanted me. Right as the horror of his words settled into my chest, the dark windows of the cafe were violently flooded with red and blue emergency lights. The screech of heavy police tires tore through the rain outside. Caleb snagged his head toward the door, his face instantly draining of color as a half-dozen armed officers from the Economic Crimes Unit blew through the entrance, weapons drawn. The performance was permanently over. The handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, but as they dragged him out into the pouring rain, I didn't feel a single ounce of victory. I didn't feel relief. I just felt an absolute hollow emptiness. The monster being thrown into the back of that cruiser wasn't a stranger. It was the man who had sat at my dining table, the man who had cried at my husband's casket, the man I had trusted with the keys to my home. And the sickening reality was that during every single one of those intimate family moments, he knew exactly how Owen's lungs had stopped working. The investigation is closed, but the wreckage remains. The truth didn't set me free, it just poisoned my past. Every beautiful memory I have of the last 10 years, the college road trips, the late night dinners, the birthdays, is completely corrupted. I look back at my own life, and I can no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a calculated trap. I sit in front of Owen's portrait in our broken apartment, staring at the shattered drywall, wondering how a man could live so beautifully, yet die so utterly alone in the dark. I found the truth, but the truth left me with nothing.